Echo Episode 2 answers one of the show's biggest mysteries, but it also opens up the door for Maya to become a key member of the street-level Avengers team that Marvel is probably assembling, preferably with Spider-Man and Daredevil leading the team against the Kingpin. Basically, I think she's going to be a cooler, much more interesting Iron Fist. Welcome to ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy, and this is all of the Easter eggs, references, and little things you might have missed in episode 2 of Echo. And before we break this baby down, I just gotta thank all of you for watching and continuing to support us by shopping at our merch store, where we make all the merch ourselves. Now, in celebration of Echo and the return of Kingpin and Daredevil, we have new shirts this month. The Nelson vs. Murdoch Vigilante Justice tee, Doug as Daredevil, Murdoch and Nelson Law and Order t-shirt, and this sweet Return of the King. Also, on our merch store, you can buy tickets to our very first live show in Brooklyn, New York on February 22nd, where you can meet me and the rest of the ScreenCrush team. We're going to talk about things that they don't let us do on the channel, show exclusive videos, and even have a Q&A plus meet and greet. Guys, thank you so much for watching. The link for all that is below. Now let's get started. So we start with the Marvel logo with the sound of an EKG machine in a hospital. Now, this is connecting to the ending of episode 1 when we saw Kingpin in a hospital room, but it also resonates with Maya and Daredevil. Daredevil, of course, is blind, but he can detect enemies by listening to their heartbeats, while Maya, who was Daredevil's enemy turned lover in the comics, can't hear anything, but she can feel her own heartbeat. The first time she killed a man last episode, she focused on her own heartbeat. And every time the show places us in her shoes, the sound of the world is tuned out and all we can hear is what she feels, her own heart beating inside of her chest. But I also want to mention that one of our team members, Brianna McLarty, took a more literal interpretation of this. When she's holding the man, she can feel his heartbeat, and it escalates as he's dying until she kills him and the heartbeat finally stops. Now, this show is very steeped in the myth and lore of the Choctaw Nation, and the writers even submitted their scripts to tribal leaders to gain their approval. So this attention to the myth and focus on the heart makes me wonder if we will see a mythical Choctaw creature called the glass water drop. This is a shadow being that only makes its own heart visible. When people focus on this creature's heart, it leads them astray. Just like Maya's quest for revenge, following her heart, following her anger and emotions, seems to be leading her astray. She's trying to take over the Kingpin's empire instead of trying to tear it down.
It will be mine. Oh yes, it will be mine.
The episode begins with a very cool tracking shot beginning underneath the water on the bottom of a Choctaw canoe. And notice here how the oars are actually shaped like leaves. Very cool detail showing how they are drawing inspiration for their architecture and tools from nature. And then the camera pulls back to reveal a Choctaw settlement in what is now Alabama in 1200 AD. Now notice how flourishing this civilization was. Great mounds, protective walls, freestanding structures instead of the teepees they always showed us in old westerns. Like, I bet a lot of people didn't even know that there was civilizations like this across the United States. And that's because history books tend to show Native American tribes as most white settlers found them when they were devastated by disease.
What do you mean by that?
Well, after the Spanish landed on this continent in the 1500s, they brought diseases that spread throughout North America and killed upwards of 90% of the indigenous population. So, by the time the Mayflower landed in the 1600s, they found natives that were already struggling to keep their civilizations alive. So what we see in history books is often reflected as the remnants of these once great civilizations. And just overall, I love how the show is doing such a great job of preserving the Choctaw culture and language.
Oh, do you speak Choctaw?
No, do you?
No, but I am going to learn a new language this year. I am finally going to learn Huttese, McClunky, Han Mabuki.
Doug, wait, listen. Huttese is not a real language, it's just a bunch of gibberish they made up on set.
Oh, really?
Really, but there are other fictional languages like Klingon or Elvish you could learn, or you can make it your New Year's resolution to learn an actual language with Babbel. They're the sponsor of this video. Babbel makes learning a new language so easy. So for example, I took Spanish in high school, but I was really bad at it. I thought learning a new language was just like learning vocabulary words, so I struggled at the class. But Babbel teaches you the language slowly from the ground up. The lessons use situations in language that you would actually use in the real world, and it's all very slow-paced and easy to understand, like this.
Buenos dias.
Buenos dias. which means good morning. The lessons are all like that, slow and easy to digest. I do mine for about 10 minutes every morning. Babbel helps you to start speaking a new language in just 3 weeks, with lessons that are made by actual language teachers and not some AI or an algorithm. In fact, right now, you can get 60% off on your subscription during Babbel's New Year's sale by clicking the link below or scanning this QR code. Like, I was always too intimidated to start a new language, but Babbel makes it so easy. And I am telling you, Babbel really works. University studies have shown that 15 hours of Babbel equals an entire semester semester of college Spanish, and they offer lessons in 14 different languages. For instance, a couple years ago I went to Italy, and thanks to Babbel, I was able to order in restaurants and find my way around Rome.
Does anyone here speak English?
Babbel has a few different subscriptions to choose from, so if you're interested in learning a new language, this is a great opportunity to try it out. Plus, they offer a 20-day money-back guarantee, so you can try and see if it's right for you. Click our link in the description or scan this QR code to get started today. Alright, so back to Echoes. Some of these mounds featured in the Choctaw City actually still exist today, scattered across the southern United States. And I just want to point out that we recently saw another indigenous civilization recreated in the MCU, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in the show What If. And that village also featured period-accurate protective walls around the village. Then the camera, which by the way is still in that single shot that was coming from the river, pushes in past the walls to show the Choctaw playing stickball. This is a real historical game that is still played to this day. Now the game had several functions in their society. Sometimes it was just for recreation or festivals, but other times the games were actually used as a substitute for war. Instead of engaging in battle and causing bloodshed, different tribes would settle disputes from these games, and then they would all agree to accept the outcome, which is why Loak says, and I think it's so interesting that modern, Western sports kind of do the same thing.
What do you mean? Oh, you mean like how the Yankees and the Red Sox play each other so New York and Boston don't go to war?
Kind of, but not really. I mean, sports do allow for nationalism to have an outlet that is healthy and productive and doesn't get anyone killed. Like, for instance, we have the World Cup, or how the football rivalry between the Rangers and Celtics allow the Catholics and Protestants in the UK to work out their differences without bloodshed. Now, as the camera pushes in on this match, notice how the aspect ratio shifts. We go from the standard 16:9 aspect ratio into this 1:3 IMAX ratio to really show the scope of these games. The games are also shot with a wide angle lens. Notice the distortion we see here at the edge of the frame, and thanks to our lead editor Randolf Nombrado for that observation. So our hero Loak is easily winning until the other team brings in a heavy ringer off the bench. Now notice how Loak was winning with speed and agility, but the big guy is able to muss his way out of the scrum to control the ball. Now Loak, this episode reveals, is indeed Maya's ancestor like we theorized last episode. I promise I didn't watch ahead. I actually just came up with that theory and wrote the episode 1 video. And later in the episode, Scully says,
"They're tricky. You can never predict when they might come calling."
Now look, we'll talk about Maya's ancestors granting her powers in just a bit, but for now, we can see many parallels being drawn between the ancestors and Maya. Loak goes up against somebody bigger and stronger than her, like how Maya is going up against the Kingpin in the present day. So in this scene, we see Loak drawing from the power of her ancestors, Chafa and the Proto-Choctaw who still lived inside the earth. Now, the consequences of a loss are that she and her people will be banished from this land. And this goes back to something we talked about last episode. Human civilizations have always been either nomadic or agrarian, hunters or farmers, and the pendulum often just swings between the two, with one replacing the other throughout human history. Maya had roots in Oklahoma, but then a tragedy forced her to uproot and become more of a nomad, and now we're seeing the same fate about to befall her ancestor. Similarly, in the modern day, Maya's aunt does not want her to stay in Tahoma. She wants her to move on. In effect, much like Loak, she's being banished from her land. So the match ends inside another scrum.
Scrum? What's a scrum?
It's a rugby term. I don't know what they call it in stickball, where Loak is given powers by her ancestors. And when this happens, she sees the same spiral shape that we saw in the creation story. Now, in our last video, we talked about the recurrence of spirals in nature, from the DNA helix to spiral galaxies, and how spirals, especially the golden spiral, are seen as proof of intelligent design. Now, in this episode, that is appropriate, since these spirals are tied to the creation story of the Choctaw people. And then we go to the opening credits. Now, we're not going to break down every element of this, because certain parts of this are going to be more evident with their meaning by the end of the series. So we'll be saving a lot of this for our final breakdown, when we can really point out all the illusions that they're making. But I just want to point out a few things here. One, there is a continual use of shadow puppets. Now, this of course calls back to Maya and Bonnie telling the creation story back in episode 1. And in our last breakdown, I talked about how shadow puppets are some of the earliest forms of cinema, using moving images to tell a story through projected light. But also, shadow puppets tell a story with your hands, just like Maya communicates through sign language. So, all through the credits, we see the recurrence of hands used to tell stories, whether to tell the stories of animals or myths, or just to show Maya pointing a finger gun. And I also love how these credits are in the style of one of the truly great Southern Gothic stories, True Detective Season 1. These credits show how all of these locations and events are layered with subtext, meaning, and especially history. For instance, we see Kingpin with only half his face visible because of Maya shooting out one of his eyes at the end of Hawkeye's finale. And we also see this echo effect on Maya, which has a couple of different meanings. One, it calls back to her comic book name, Echo. In the comics, this is because she has the ability to copy or echo the powers of others. But here, I think it also means that she is a metaphorical echo of her ancestors' powers. And then we go to the present day. Now notice the drawings hanging up in the house. In the show Hawkeye, we saw that Maya has always surrounded herself with artwork, in her room as a child and even in her apartment in New York. And just like in her apartment, her childhood home has a silent alarm.
What was that?
I don't know. There are like strobe lights attached to the wall.
So then Biscuits shows up, and you know what? I really like this character for a couple reasons. One, his name is Biscuits, and that's one of my favorite foods, but also I can really relate to him. I'd like to think that if I were in the MCU, that I'd be somebody like Captain America or Spider-Man. But if we're being real, I'd be Biscuits, an ordinary guy selling his PlayStation to fix a borrowed car. He's driving his Grandma Chula's mail truck, and notice how this doesn't say USPS on the truck or the logo, but it does say Rural Mail Carrier. Now these are post office freelancers in rural areas who drive their own vehicles usually to deliver mail. Although rural mail carriers do technically use the post office logo, so maybe they didn't use it in the show because the USPS didn't approve of one of their trucks being used to plant a bomb on a train. I also thought it was a nice touch that Biscuits is wearing an Oklahoma University shirt. Their mascot is the Sooner, a white pony, like the Pony Express, an early network for delivering mail.
Hey, why is the steering wheel in there backwards?
Well, it's always backwards on mail trucks so the driver can be closer to the mailboxes.
Oh, see, I don't drive or get the mail or anything like that because I'm just a little dog.
I know you are, buddy. So we go to Scully's pawn shop, and as we pointed out last episode, per Ken Christensen, a writer on this show, Scully is a Choctaw word for money. And then we get the return of the great Graham Greene, who you might remember from this role in The Last of Us.
Why did you shoot him?
The gun's all the way over there.
So Scully is an incredibly smart, capable person, and yet we see him here hawking crap to white tourists and gentrifiers. In fact, a lot of literature about modern Native Americans, particularly the stories by the great writer Sherman Alexie, tend to focus on how tribes are now coping with poverty. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, the median income on reservations is $14,000 compared to $41,000 in the rest of the USA. In fact, there's even a sign in the window offering payday loans, which are often used by people who are living in poverty or hand-to-mouth. So that is why we see Scully being forced to take advantage of the gullible, cartoonish white people. Get it? He's chanting, buy the damn thing, buy the damn thing. The couple says they want to buy a Navajo rug while they're in a store with a Choctaw flag in the window. And this is because they're using the term Navajo, which is an actual Native American tribe, as a kind of brand name instead of, trying to honor their actual civilization or their artwork. Now this couple are not interested in representing or honoring tribal customs. They are there to appropriate those customs for the sake of their own decor.
Do you have any of those Navajo rugs?
And then Biscuit steps in and says,
Drive over to Anthropology and get your Navajo rug, but that's all stuff from Madripoor.
Now, Madripoor might sound familiar. It is a fictional country from Marvel Comics where basically there are no laws. Wolverine used to travel there undercover as the hero called Patch, and now it's probably most famous for appearing in Falcon the Winter Soldier. It's where Zemo did this. God, I love Baron Z. I really want that character to come back in the MCU. And then we cut to Chula organizing an event or some kind of fair. So this scene does a couple of things. One, it immediately draws a parallel with the opening when we see the village of the Choctaw people when they were at their height. Now, the tribal leaders can only rebuild a facsimile of that original village, but it can never match the real thing. It can only be an echo of the past.
Oh, so the title of the show has many layered meanings, person. Very good.
Thank you, Doug. So for instance, she talks about the optimal placement of speakers to replicate the sound of the tribal drums in the opening sequence. After she finds out Maya's back, Chula visits Black Crow's skating rink set to Casey and JoJo's All My Life, which is ironic in this scene because the lyrics of that song talk about being close to someone, with lyrics like, close to me you're like my mother, close to me you're like my sister. But the scene is essentially about Chula essentially cutting ties with Maya and banishing her from this land. Now from what we see in this episode, Kingpin's operation is deeply embedded within this town, with Henry Black Crow shipping weapons from probably Mexico to New York. So it would be common knowledge that Maya took her dad's place in the Kingpin's organization. But the centerpiece of this episode is this train sequence. One of the best Disney Plus action sequences I have seen since, I guess, the opening of Falcon and the Winter Soldier. So this sequence won me over right off the bat when Maya jumps off the bridge all badass, but then misjudges the jump and falls. I love moments like this in my superhero stories, when we get to see superheroes make very human mistakes, like Captain America misjudging his new strength or Peter face-planting when he was web-slinging.
I'm good.
This is one of the reasons I love the character Hawkeye so much. Having an ordinary guy amongst all the superhumans reminds us all of how truly awesome their powers are.
What happened?
When Maya counts the guards, the sound design tunes out all of the other sounds to focus on her concentration and her point of view. And notice that she's going after the car called D9X, probably named after Daredevil issue 9, the first appearance of Echo in the comics. Now, when she drills into the car, she uses a red light, and we do keep seeing the occurrence of the color red with Maya, specifically with red representing her life of crime and spreading further bloodshed. When we first saw her in Hawkeye, she was bathed in red light, and this was taking place when she was fully immersed in the Kingpin's operation. So, after she plants the bomb, we get a key moment. She misjudges her jump, crushing her leg and the coupling between cars, and then, just like Loak in the opening, she sees visions of her ancestors, giving her strength, but not just spiritual strength like literal superpowered strength. Now, we talked about this in our last video, but ancestors are a very important part of Choctaw culture. Now, sometime after their creation myth, the story goes that they traveled to escape a great flood, carrying the bones of their ancestors along with them, but once they found a home, they buried their ancestors in the new land. In the same way, Maya has returned to her roots and is now able to access the spirits of her ancestors. We see the original Choctaw when they were still made of clay, the first Choctaw woman, and then Loak. Now, in the Choctaw creation story, we saw these clay people emerge from pools that contained a spiral of light. And then, years later, these ancestors can call upon this same spiral magic to help Maya, appearing on her palms just like it did for her ancestors. And I just gotta say, I really hope they don't do that MCU thing where they explain this to death. This doesn't have to be aliens or like a demon god from another dimension or whatever. Just let this be an unexplained myth. Let it be magic. Let it be spiritual. Let this universe feel bigger by not explaining every little thing. So she makes sparks in the wheels of the train so Biscuits can find her. Very clever. And then she finally executes a jump correctly, gracefully imitating her stickball playing ancestor from the opening sequence. And then we go to downtown New York City. And notice how they keep Avengers Tower out of frame. It always really bothers me when we see the New York City skyline in shows like Hawkeye, and Avengers Tower is not where it's supposed to be.
Yeah, you know, I feel like the idea of who bought Avengers Tower was important to fans, but Marvel just kind of forgot about it.
I know, but maybe Avengers Tower was bought by the street-level big bad of the MCU, Wilson Fisk. Then he can reside in Fisk Tower like he does in the comics. That would be super cool. And by the way, when you take a closer look at Maya's homemade bomb, you can see that its housing looks like it's made from an LED camping lantern. So this LED makes an IED. Very clever. After the explosion, Maya goes to Scully to get a replacement leg, and notice he's wearing a shirt that reads The Natives, but in the Beatles font. Now this is an actual t-shirt that parodies the Beatles walking across Abbey Road, just with tribal members instead. And also, the flag in the window here is the actual flag of the Choctaw Nation. Maya says she blew up the train car because they hit her first. And I think this must be her talking about the stab wound that she had treated in episode 1. But I think the arc of this series is actually going to be about her moving past this kind of thinking. Maya was filled with rage toward Ronan for killing her father, and then Clint tried to explain to her that that rage was going to destroy her. But instead, she's transferred that anger onto the Kingpin. She is still caught in this cycle of violence, an eye for an eye that could eventually destroy her or her people. Scully MacGyvers her a temporary leg, and then he reminds Maya and the audience about the creation story and her ancestors' heritage.
Jaffa and the ancestors would watch out for family in times of need.
Frankly, I'm really glad they changed her powers for the MCU. See, in the comics, she has the ability to copy other people when she sees them, but that would have been too much like the Taskmaster, who's already returning to the MCU in the Thunderbolts. Giving her super strength that draws from the power of her ancestors basically makes her into a cool Iron Fist. I also like the little detail that Maya's new leg, creaks a little bit. It's setting us up for the reveal of her super shiny new leg that, I don't know, maybe will have a machine gun embedded in it like Rose McGowan's in Planet Terror. And then we cut back to Biscuits and the total look of abject fear on his face when his grandma sees how much he totaled her truck. And then he accidentally lets it slip to Maya's cousin Bonnie that Maya is back in town. Now remember, Bonnie was Maya's childhood best friend, and here actually she is played by Devery Jacobs, who also voiced Kahori in What If.
Hey, that's really cool.
Yes, it is. And there's another connection to What If in this scene. The guy who is fixing Biscuit's truck is actually played by another great What If voice actor. This is your mom. Now back at Maya's house, she is confronted by Black Crow. She tries to make it seem like he needs to choose either her or Fisk, but he's making it clear that he is actually choosing his people first, while Maya is only looking out for herself. It's another reminder for Maya that she has been basically torn apart and separated from her home and her people. Much like the threat to Loak in the opening sequence, she has been metaphorically banished from her homeland. Now this is why she shoots up the swing set where she and Bonnie used to play. The memory of that old tent is a reminder of this being a home where she can never truly belong. So she fires on it to further detach herself from her past. But the spirits of her ancestors are still here, binding her to her home. She can never sever that deeper connection that she has to her people. Now, I do wonder what Scully meant when he said,
You can never predict when they might come calling.
Like, there is a serious mystery lurking in this show, and I have no idea what happens next. Also, I should mention the jacket she wears in this scene with the sun over her chest is like the uniform that she wore in the comics. So like, I am very into this show so far. I think that Marvel is slowly building up a street-level universe, with the Kingpin being the new Thanos for the low-powered heroes of New York City. And I'm loving how they're taking what worked from the Netflix series and using that in the MCU. But what I'm really hoping to see here is to see Spider-Man become a part of all this. Like maybe the show's Echo and Daredevil set up Kingpin as this unstoppable force, and Spider-Man gets drawn into the fight in his new movie. I mean, after all, Tom Holland is now wearing a cloth suit with no ties to the Avengers or anything high-tech, so that would make him fit in perfectly with the street-level, low-tech branch of the MCU. And by the way, the street-level gang war stories from the 80s Amazing Spider-Man comics are some of my favorite Spider-Man stories of all time, so I really hope that's what they're building toward. Well guys, that's just what I thought of the episode. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe and smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.